Well, we're at 12:04, so we're going to go ahead and get started here, guys. Thanks again for joining us in this webinar. Just to maybe recap a little bit, what we're going to be covering today is really digging into the nuts and bolts of what it looks like when you acquire a light manufacturer. We've got Sam Rosati on the line here. I'll let Sam introduce himself, but he knows this space very well. Bought a business, bought another light manufacturer, sold it, bought a second light manufacturer. So he sort of knows this world. And so we're gonna dig in, and we'll talk through that agenda in a second. But just briefly, so you know us a little bit, my background's largely in software. I built a SaaS software business called Contactually, venture-backed, and sold that business in 2019. And since then, I'm still with our acquiring company, Compass, run all of our lead gen and marketing, and just IPO'd the business about a month ago. And in addition to that, I run a small property management business, and I invest in a lot of self-funded search deals. So obviously looking to get to know these different industries better, and certainly looking to meet with good self-funded searchers too. So that's a quick background on me. Sam, you want to give your 1 or 2 minute pitch?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Appreciate you doing this.
Yeah, of course.
So M&A guy by background, recovering M&A lawyer, recovering CPA. I did a career pivot by starting a self-funded search. The story goes, I went out to buy one business to run and own for 20 years. I bought two, this being one of them. So that was sort of curveball number one. Then, thought, great, we'd run them forever and retire as the owner operators and sell, and had quick exits on both of them. So we got really fortunate, but turned the search, Pursuant Capital, right back into what is essentially a micro private equity firm, buying small, micro middle market SMBs, small businesses, mostly in Florida, that we usually are very active in. And then we also partner with self-funded searchers. So we either passively invest or are much more of a partnership relationship with self-funded searchers around the US to do more of the same.
Awesome. Thanks, Sammy. I think what's special about your background is, you've been in the trenches, right? You've acquired businesses, the self-funded search world well from the boots on the ground experience. But now you've also, I know, invested in a bunch of different deals. You're putting together an incubator. Like, you are been a great resource for me as I've been getting more and more in the weeds of this world, and I know a lot of a great resource for other searchers too. So really excited to have you on and to dig into your experience here. Thanks again for joining.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, this will be fun.
So just want to remind folks of what we're going to be doing for the next several weeks, and then we'll talk more about light manufacturing. So I'm looking at a ton of deals these days across a bunch of different industries, and the natural question that I keep realizing is I don't really have a depth of experience in any one of these areas. And when I'm talking to searchers, we're all largely in the same boat, right? None of us grew up, or the vast majority of us didn't grow up in an HVAC company. Our parents didn't run one, or we don't have any relevant experience in HVAC or lawn care or whatever it is. And so I thought it'd be really awesome to take someone like Sam, who knows an industry really deeply, and really dig into the weeds and be as tactical as possible around, what does it look like in their industry? What are the pitfalls? What are the opportunities? How do they evaluate a good versus great business? And to really, again, dig deeply. So I reached out to a lot of folks in the self-funded search world, trying to get a feel for what are those industries where people are looking the most. And these were the ones that came up here. So we're doing light manufacturing first, but there's many others we're going to be doing throughout the summer. So if you're interested in listening on these and you haven't already, go ahead and email webinars@bluemaple.co, and you'll get invited to all these future ones. So we'll see where it goes. The schedule will probably change, but I think it'll be exciting for us all to sort of dig in a little more deeply into each of these. And just to speak to what we'll cover today, and this will be a rough format for these moving forward. It's really, Sam and I were riffing on this earlier. I get really pissed off when I'm listening to a podcast and people are sort of talking up here very high level. I like to get into the weeds and really understand the details of things. And so that's what I'm hoping to do here today is, we'll talk through, if you're thinking about the light manufacturing space, why is this a good industry for ETA? what's good versus great, how do we, or where should we be spending time when we're thinking about acquiring a business, et cetera. And Sam did a great job prepping slides here that sort of speaks to his experience, which we'll walk through. So this is one bit of housekeeping. Everyone who's coming in is muted by default, and I think just given the volume of folks who are on the call today, that makes the most sense. But if you do have questions, just go ahead and send those over chat. I'm not going to be able to to bring those up as we go along, but we are going to save time at the end to address any questions and to dig in any areas where you guys want to go from here. So definitely send those questions over chat, and we'll get to them toward the end. So with that, Sam, why don't you just give us first a quick summary on Patio Products and how things have been going?
I'd love to. And let me just refer back to a couple of slides ago where you're going to review a whole handful of different industries. 5 years later, we are still looking at different industries every day, and we still feel like the dumbest guy in the room when we're sitting in a management meeting, and that never changes. So I always like to remind searchers, if you're a first timer, or you're early on in your process, and you're wondering how you can feel and act intelligently in those early meetings in industries you don't fully understand, it just takes time, and I'm not sure it ever changes. So anyway, with that backdrop, yeah, let's dive in.
Let's do it.
So Patio Products is a light manufacturing business in Tampa Bay, Florida. The business is really simple. They make primarily one thing, which is patio screen doors, aluminum patio screen doors that go on lanai screens, which are the enclosures around pools, mostly in Southeast USA and Florida, and then multifamily. So condos, apartment buildings usually are screened in, and on the bottom floor, there's usually a screen door that opens and closes. So sort of another way to describe it too is we're a high volume manufacturer of those products, high volume, low cost. So you kind of can think about where that fits in the value chain. The business, just quick and dirty. When we bought it, to be clear, 6 million and change of sales, $750,000, so 750 grand of adjusted EBITDA. And I always like to emphasize and differentiate EBITDA from seller discretionary earnings. Happy to go into that later if that's helpful. But this was true EBITDA because the owner was a very elderly gentleman who was not active in the day-to-day. And so the general manager, Linda, she was a really strong operator and was running the business independently of the seller. So her comp was had already burdened the EBITDA. So it was EBITDA, not owner earnings.
Yeah, that's great.
And to be clear, we closed on the business for $2.5 million. That was not our first. When we closed, it was not the first time in the process. The deal actually came back to us. We bid about a year before. It was a broker deal, and it circled back to us. We lost it initially, and it came back to us a year later.
Came back, and you ended up having to bid more, or came back at roughly the same price?
Same price. They came back and said, "Hey, are you still interested?" We said, "We certainly are, unless something has materially changed with the financial picture. Our offer kind of stands where it was." And we generally struck a deal around that same offer from our initial bid. So definitely one of the rare times that patience pays off.
Yeah, seriously. And congrats. I mean, that price, not knowing this industry particularly well, 3.5x on an EBITDA number that feels pretty real, that includes that manager salary, feels great. I mean, would you say that, did you guys equally feel like that was a great deal, or is that sort of the norm in this particular sub-industry?
Yeah, great question. So I am by nature a value guy. So I kind of see the world in value terms, trying to get the best price in terms you can, trying to shake that out of me and become more of a pay a fair price for a great business instead of a low price for a fair business. That's hard to do. I'm still working at it. But I'd say at the time, we were newer at being searchers. And I think the other thing is this business has some risks that we thought were possible bombs that we need to protect against. This is They do sell into new construction as an end market, but that's not all of the revenue. There's a big chunk of the revenue that repeats. It's sales of screen doors that are being replaced because they wear out, not because they're going in new homes. But that's a risk, new construction in Florida. We thought, at the end of the day, this was a good price. I think what really helped us was that the seller note that we negotiated had a mechanism in there to call it a forgiveness mechanism, where, and the SBA may have changed on this, it depends on who you speak to, but the balance of the seller note would actually decrease or be forgiven based on the performance of 2 key customers. And so we hedged a lot of our customer concentration risk in this deal through the forgivable mechanism in the seller note. So we liked that a lot too.
Yeah, that sounds like a great way to de-risk. And to your point, I know there's been some changes with SBA. I'm not sure, I can't speak articulately to it, but I think you're right. That may not be possible today.
Yeah,
I don't want to.
I think it really. Oh,
go ahead,
Tony. Sorry about that.
No, please, Sam. Finish your thought.
I think it still is a possibility to do. I think that the mechanism has to just tie back to a historical metric. So
yeah, not a future growth target. It has to be exactly based on historicals. That's my understanding too.
Yep.
Okay.
Exactly.
Cool. I feel like I could ask you a million questions about the business itself, but I'm sure folks want to sort of understand the learnings you took away. So why don't we maybe hop to the next slide and sort of talk through some of how you thought about this versus others, good versus great type of thing, and maybe dig into some of the lessons. Does that sound good to you?
Yeah, that sounds great.
So maybe first, before we talk about the specifics, like I don't know anything about manufacturing. I don't know if it sounds like you didn't either. Like, how did you end up in this category versus others? And as you're thinking about searchers who are maybe considering this space, why was this one appealing?
Yeah, great question. So when we set out, did we want to go buy a manufacturing company? No. I know there are some folks that do, and I think that's fantastic, especially if you have a background. But for us, it was very tangible. So I think we liked the idea that there was a tangible product we were making. It is not an overly complicated product. This is not highly engineered. This is not a complicated manufacturing process. I think one of the cool opportunities in manufacturing is a lot of buyers think that every manufacturer is hugely capital intensive and complicated. And now, a few years later, we've bought in a few light manufacturers. This one, the other one we bought, they are more like fabrication shops. They are maybe cutting metal, maybe bending it and welding it, but they are not having to buy this vast array of equipment to make this product. So this is a fab shop, and so we liked that.
It sort of scares away, it sounds like, a lot of other maybe potential buyers, and or depresses the prices that you could get as a seller. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, 100%. Definitely the case. So a lot of the things that searchers like about service businesses really do exist in light manufacturing. They're kind of easy to scale. They're not capital intensive. And again, a lot, especially in self-funded search, where it's sometimes just one person trying to be an owner operator of a corporation. If you can get a low price and use a lot of SBA debt, you can in many ways be, an owner of 80 or 90% of that business, and maybe just have 1 or 2 investors alongside you, which is what we had.
Totally.
So what else? Why did we buy light manufacturing? Again, I think the tangible nature of the product was great. You can just drive around and see just tracks of homes that needed the product. So it felt like, even if construction cycled down a little bit, this was always going to be a repeating need to sell this product. I think it's key to sort of figure out where you sit in the value chain and what your competitive landscape looked like. We were a high volume, low cost provider. So, for better, for worse, but on the for better side, there was just nobody else that could compete with us on pricing. And you always worry, can somebody just go out and start a business and start producing this product at a cheaper cost than you could? And there was just no chance. So just some of the tips that little things we looked for, and it worked out.
To that point, that was my initial thought when you were saying how, most people think this industry is very capital intensive. It's not. I would think if it was high capital intensity, that's a nice moat, right? That would prevent competition. And when you first described it, my reaction was, what would stop a competitor from coming in? And you're saying on the one hand, maybe this business in particular was one that was very operationally efficient, maybe, and as a result could do these much lower price points. But do you think that's true of most attractive light manufacturers, that they've sort of figured out a way to protect themselves competitively from other entrants? And if so, like, how would you identify someone who has that like competitive advantage?
That's a great question. Yeah. So the thing about capital intensity is, yeah, it can be a moat, but you may have to reinvest in that moat, and you may have to burden your P&L with that capital intensivity to protect your moat, and that's a little scary. In our case, we felt like the moat was a highly efficient operation where we were pumping out 700 to 800 screen doors a day. And so when you think about what kind of operation it takes to pump out that much product in a day, it's a pretty skilled, pretty efficient operation.
Sure.
And then secondarily, to have a customer base and a brand name that is relied upon to produce and sell that volume, we just felt like there was a little moat there that didn't necessarily require capital investment to protect. And that's the nice thing about light manufacturing.
And so I guess, and I saw a chat just came in asking like what was that moat that you saw that? And it sounded like the thesis was like just to scale out that volume required expertise and experience in this industry. For someone who didn't have experience to try to ratchet to that scale would be really difficult. And so the branding and customer relationships you had already, like that was a natural little moat. And that feels pretty applicable, I would think, to lots of different businesses that are very niche, you wouldn't necessarily know about. And I assume this is probably a regional player as well. So not only niche type of manufacturing, but also little niche area. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think maybe one thing I forgot was, so this business sells to distribution. So it sells to business that will sell to contractors and homeowners. So we were not selling to people that were buying 1, 2, and 3 doors. We were selling to customers that were buying 100, 200, 1,000 doors. And so in order to get those customers and to have them stick around, you have to be able to pump out volume of product.
Sure.
And if you think about one guy going and starting a competitor, he's just not going to be able to pump out enough product early on to take customer base from you.
And obviously the downside to that is theoretically customer concentration. If you've got a handful of these folks you're selling to that are buying major orders that are taking 40% of your business, that's obviously not great. But if you had to pick the lesser of two evils, having maybe heavier customer concentration but higher volume to more of an enterprise sale versus selling to lots of residential or lots of individuals, sounds like you would err on the former. Is that fair?
That's very fair, with the heavy caveat that we got some nice structure in the seller note to mitigate that risk.
Yeah,
because that was a risk. There was,
yeah.
Yep. Mm-hmm, definitely.
What were those top, like what percent of either revenue or EBITDA were those top two customers?
Mid 30s, both top line and bottom line of our business, mid 30%. So together they were pretty, yep, together. Yep.
Yes. And at what point would you have been, if the seller note was not there protecting that performance, would you have still done the deal?
Oh man, that's a great question. At the time, we were when this business boomeranged back to us, we were about a year into our search. So I was starting to feel a little pressure. I think that most folks do. And I think it really starts making you ask questions like, what's good enough in a business to buy? And so I think we would have thought pretty hard, but the leverage we had, them coming back to us, was nice, because usually that's not the case.
Yeah, fair. Yeah, that I think that point around like, man, when you're obviously feeling fatigue, especially as a self-funded searcher, right? You've been going at it, no salary, right? Like at what point do you sort of Do you take whatever best deal you have, or do you throw in the towel? And then every deal has hair, and this one's something you got around with the seller note. But I see this very consistently, and that's why I posed the question of, like, customer concentration, but you've got some enterprise clients versus the individuals. But yeah, I think it's just really tough. I think maybe the takeaway here is, if you can push to a seller note with this structure, that's ideal. And then if you didn't have that, what do you have a gut feel for what level of concentration, let's say of the top, call it 3, 4, 5 customers, you would say you wouldn't go beyond X% of revenue?
I gotta tell you, we
30%,
still fight.
40%?
Yeah, we still fight this issue even today. But I would say top single customer in the teens is probably as high as you want to go. And
Okay.
then sort of top 5, ideally sub 50. But this is a small business, and every deal is hairy. So like the broad takeaway is, you've got to figure out for yourself what's good enough.
Yeah.
But a quick read, like if you have a SBA lender in hand and he or she is willing to give you a useful read on this stuff, usually there'll be a nice sanity check, because a lot of banks will have their own sort of, credit standards on that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's fair. I realize I'm going to drag us into like overtime doing asking these questions. So let's skip to sort of good versus great. I love posing the question this way, because we're all looking at, potential companies to acquire. And I really like the distinction of like a deal you definitely would want to do versus one that's like, maybe if you had some good things. And so walk me through maybe why these 4, and how you thought about the delineation of good versus great here.
Right. So for me, the first question is always, and maybe this is different for others, but for us, it's always, how do I know this business is going to exist 10 years from now? Growth will take care of itself, but I need the business to exist 5 or 10 years from now in order to reach that growth, especially with leverage on it. So, the best way to think about future growth or future revenue stability is, has there been past revenue stability? So, kind of, and I'll say, in another business we bought, it was a bit turnaroundy, but this one was really steady for the 5 prior years. The margins were steady, so we didn't. A lot of times in manufacturing businesses, and with kind of crappy numbers, meaning low quality of financial reporting, you'll just see numbers go like this on margin profile, and it's just confusing, and it complicates like the analysis. So steady margins, stability of revenue. I mean, that is core to what we look for.
And do you think is that a true, that feels like these are true statements across, many industries. Is that particularly true, you think, of manufacturing? And if so, why?
Yeah, I do, because at least one of the big hurdles, and we'll talk about it later, to light manufacturing is, not only do you have to deal with the labor force input like service companies do, but you have to deal with cost of product, right? Material inputs. And, as we're finding out right now, in another light manufacturer we own, material inputs are just going crazy right now. And so margins are swinging like crazy, depending on how prices are getting increased for our customers. So I think it's even more important in product businesses.
That makes a ton of sense. And I know we're going to touch on sort of the inventory costs and how that can sort of really hurt in a few slides. But yeah, compared to a service business, I can see how that would be particularly unique here for sure.
Right. And then, not a trick, but one of the things that experience has taught us is, if you can buy a business that has a truly passive seller, regardless of what the broker is telling you, which is probably wrong, if the owner is truly passive and you can believe that story, there's clearly somebody running the business. And that for us has been a trick, to buy companies where owner is passive. There's an incumbent GM who's reliable, because then, especially a searcher who doesn't know the space can come in and not have to worry on day one, where's revenue coming from? Like, who's going to make the product?
Totally.
That's all in place. You can just sort of sit on top of the business and take some time to learn. I think it's really.
What are like the 1 or 2 questions or things you would look to assess that? Is it just the presence of that GM and a commensurate salary, or something more nuanced?
No, because you see a lot of times there is a GM, but the owner is still there.
Yeah.
It's, is the owner 60 or 85? Is does the owner live down the street and comes in 5 days a week and on Saturday
Mm,
to, oversee? Or does the owner live in North Carolina 4 months a year?
that's a great
There's
point.
some things like that.
So location, if they're obviously absent that way, age, anything else? Because
Yeah, everything
I'm asking,
else.
this I think is a really important point, but I think it's also really, really hard to assess.
It is. And you can do it other ways. Call them at 9 o'clock at night and see if they pick up the phone. And if they pick up the phone from a number they don't know, it probably means they pick up the phone a lot after hours related to their business. Little things like that. Nothing's foolproof, but little tricks.
Love that. And how about in the sales point, sort of, I guess, so the opposite, which is don't have anybody versus if you have a fully built out sales staff, it's more of a P&L. I guess I view this last point as a blessing and a curse, right? The blessing is great. The sort of adjusted EBITDA that you've sort of talked about, you're not going to have to burden the company with additional costs as you add sales. But if you don't have a sales staff, that's a lot of upside opportunity theoretically that you could grow more aggressively. So it seems like maybe a conservative take versus more of a growth focused take on that sales team. Is that fair, you think?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I think most small businesses don't really have a robust sales function. And every broker will say that. Well, what are you going to do to grow it? Just hire sales staff. So I think a good company, most good small businesses with stable revenue might not have sales staff. And that's a good thing. They're still producing consistent revenue. Great.
Right.
But an even better company will have a fully built out sales staff so that you can really lean on those folks to push further for growth. That's harder to find.
Totally. It's like maybe said another way. It's like, sure, that may mean that there isn't this like super low hanging fruit to quote bring in a sales team and accelerate sales. But it's almost what I'm hearing you say is that's a bit of a pipe dream to assume if you're going from nothing to have to staff a whole new sales team versus if you've already got the infrastructure, it's just sort of pouring gas into an engine that already is there versus having to build the engine from scratch. Fair?
Right. And if you're paying a quality salesperson 100 grand on a business doing 750 grand, well, that's a pretty big hit on your P&L. So
yeah, totally. I think this is great. I love this distinction, sort of good versus great. Now you think about it. I guess a related point, and I'm sort of touching on some of this already, is like those are the things that you would assess a good versus great. Obviously, in diligence, you're going to be trying to dig into those. But why did you call these particular additional areas out in addition to some of those other metrics?
yeah, well, I mean, so let's start at the top. Customer concentration is it's easy to spot. So it's not like one of these skeletons in the closet. But I think it needs to be a really quick proxy for go, no go on a deal. So, but if you decide, hey, like we had in this business, in the 30% of revenue and bottom line customer concentration in 2 customers, you really got to diligence. What does that mean? How long have they been with you? Who holds those relationships? Why do they keep ordering? Is there a way to structure around the risk there that we did? So even though the numbers are black and white, there is color and a story there that I like to dig into. Because at the end of the day, if those customers left, yeah, we had protection in the seller note, but would we want that business? Probably not.
Yeah. It sounds like, I mean, I'll ask you a similar question to what I asked about assessing how passive the owner is. Similarly, do you have any tips around assessing how reliant the owner is to retaining these top customers or even acquiring new customers? There's the general passivity, but I guess just specifically with these biggest customers, I'm asking that.
I mean, like most things, the best indicator of future performance is probably past performance. So have they stuck around? Is there longevity there? But really, this is hard. And in most cases, in small business, there's not a contract the way there is in a SaaS business. There's no visibility into that future ordering.
Yeah.
This is tough. This is all about
that's what gives me
understanding
heartburn
the
about
story.
this industry, right? It's not recurring at all. Well, I shouldn't say at all, but it's less recurring.
Less recurring. Maybe orders repeat, but it's certainly not recurring.
Yeah. Okay.
Inventory. So let's move on, right? I think inventory and maybe more broadly working capital is a hugely important topic for light manufacturers and physical product businesses. I think one way that there are many opportunities to kind of get the wool brought over your eyes as a buyer is in inventory, because usually sellers have no idea how much inventory they have. They certainly are going to overvalue it because they've paid for it all, but half of it might be sitting on a top shelf and not saleable. And so I think inventory is a really good place to start. I would say count it yourself. It is the biggest pain in the rear to count inventory, but there's no better way to learn a business you're about to buy than to go out there on a Saturday and count your stuff and really figure out the products you're working with.
Would it give you pause if a seller got cold feet about that?
Yeah, a little bit. It would be part of the full picture. I think it's really important. I mean, it's also really important because you're going to pay for it in the working capital target, hopefully. And if they are telling you you're getting $500,000 of inventory and you base the whole deal on $500,000 of inventory, and then you get out there and realize that half of it is not saleable, well, you just overpaid by $250,000.
Sure.
And a lot of these deals are kind of tightly financed in a way where there's not a bunch of cash flow and liquidity early on. So you don't want to step in the shoes of a tightly financed deal with a lot of inventory that won't move.
How can you, like, you didn't know anything about screen doors prior to this deal. How can you tell if it's sellable?
Well, I say here, hire a consultant to value it. And I think that's an easy one-liner to put in a PowerPoint. I think that's a really hard thing to do in real life. Again, I like seller structure. I like earnouts outside of SBA. I like ratchetable seller notes, all because if they are selling us a box of rocks, if this is bad information and they know it, it's just going to come back to haunt them down the road as the seller. So I love that alignment of interest, because to a certain respect here, inventory is a gamble that you're going to have to take.
This is a question that came in about, what if you didn't structure the inventory as part of the deal, but you sort of had the seller retain the inventory with some sort of contract or consignment to sort of buy that inventory and get paid as it sells? Obviously, the seller is going to be less interested in that, but do you think that's a deal killer for most sellers, or why not try to do something like that?
I think it's great. If you can negotiate that, that's fantastic, because it just shifts the risk over to seller instead of buyer. I think that's a hard point to win. Although you'll find in the Main Street business brokerage world, a lot of Main Street brokers are trying to sell the business and then get the buyer to pay for inventory and working capital on top of the purchase price for the business, which is crazy. There's a lot of info out there about working capital, but the way I think about it is you're buying a car, and when you drive that car off the lot, it's not going to go far if there's no gas. So when you buy the car on the lot, you need to figure out how much gas is in that tank, because it's part and parcel of your purchase price. So,
right.
Yep.
That's fair. So it sounds like if you can do it, great, but maybe to noodle, there's a needle on that point more. Would you push it? Or it sounds like what I'm hearing you say is you would probably err on the side of just either structuring the purchase such that it's sort of protecting against customer loss, incorrect inventory, et cetera, versus trying to set up something that's maybe more going to be less palatable to the seller around actually having to retain the inventory. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but does that sound right?
If you can win that point, I think it's great to have the seller effectively be responsible for the saleability of that inventory. If you can win that point, and it's a tough point to win.
Yeah.
But if you can't, there are other ways to backdoor win it, no pun intended,
through the structure.
Things like, and like a working capital adjustment, right? So, you can get in there after close, do another count, and then sort of revalue the inventory after you have control of the business and adjust through the working capital target.
Fair point.
Quick and dirty points.
The QOV, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so I think this is a big one. In SBA land, they don't necessarily require a proof of cash or a QOV. this is all about risk, and I sometimes lose sleep at night wondering, am I going to step into a fraud scenario? And so I think it's always worth spending a few $1,000s on a proof of cash. Somebody, a third party accountant telling you, yes, cash came in and cash went out in the amounts that match the P&L.
Can you take it like a step further? Like, what do you tactically need from the seller to do that? Like, are they just dumping over their QuickBooks files, or is it something more that you would need?
Yep, full pull on the GL, the general ledger.
Yep.
So a QuickBooks dump, and then bank statement dump, and then I don't know how they do that, but the QV folks tend to be able to do that pretty quickly and
Okay.
give you a sense for, if they're saying 6 of revenue and 4 of costs, or 6 of revenue, 5 of costs, to make sure $6 million of cash is coming into business and 5 of costs is coming out. It's just a sanity check on that cash flow. The question is how much, what do you really want to spend on a QAB? What's the sort of trade-off for that cost? Personal opinion,
Yeah, I guess to that, and I meant to ask this question earlier, but between this sort of both this QOV or this like basic proof of cash that you could do, what expected cost for something like that, as well as the expected cost if you hired this consultant to come in to do this third-party inventory assessment?
Yeah, I think the inventory assessment you can do for $1,000. Doesn't take a lot of money. Proof of cash is probably something that a local accounting firm can do for
Mhm.
1,000 or 2, give or take. I think full-blown Q of E is probably, if you've got some friends or a shop that understands search funds, maybe 10,000. But I certainly know folks that are charging 20, 30, 40 and are fantastic. So it's just cost benefits there.
And you think about it, it sounds like you guys did not go down that 20, 30, 40K full-blown QOV route, and you would err on the side of doing the 10K lesser QOV or a smaller shop with the proof of cash from a small firm.
Right. I think practically, we wanted to actually do a lot of the work ourselves too, to feel like we were understanding and not just, seeing what somebody else was telling us about the business. And then, we were cash poor, self-funded searchers. So really trying to do this in an economic way. Thankfully now, like, we have a deal team. So I've got a helper for every sort of advisor that I need. And most of them are willing to take some, deal risk and do it at a fair price. And that helps a lot.
Cool. And I assume for QV, I mean, that's not industry specific. The proof of cash is not industry specific. I would guess the inventory, you probably would want someone who knows the industry well. Is that a fair statement, or are there general? Yep. Yeah, it's okay, got it. And how would you identify that type of specialist, I guess, in this business?
Yeah, the consultant's hard to find for inventory. Usually you can find them from the industry. Maybe somebody was in the distribution business, so they know the product, and you can pay them to consult sort of on the side, and they're not they're a neutral party. So we actually kind of do digging to find people like that. Maybe they have a day job in the industry, so they know the space, and they're looking for a little sort of extra cash.
Yeah,
and are willing to do a
little side hustle.
Yep. Yeah.
I hear you. Okay.
Yeah.
You want to speak to these last couple of points about background check, and I don't know if there's anything specific you're referring to in that background check, and same with the material inputs and costs. Like, I'd love to get your thoughts on those.
I always like to spend a lot of time listening when you get to know the seller, have them tell their life story, and then go run a background check on them, see where they've lived, see their life history, see if everything matches. I just like to do that. And anytime I see something in a background check that wasn't disclosed, or their life story doesn't match the life story I got from them getting to know them, that's just red flags. And it's part of the full picture on what you're buying. You're putting a lot of trust in the seller who's selling something to you. And
is this
then,
just a general assessment on, like, are they honest or not, or is there something more specific you're looking for?
No, this one's not super tactical. No, this is kind of paint the full picture and see if any red flags come up. There's nothing that I look for directly on the background check. And then, I think this is probably a key one today. Material inputs. I mean, the cost of all metals, the cost of all wood, everything is going up pretty substantially. And so I mean, this is just part of a service business that you don't have to worry about. But when you buy a product business, you very much have to worry about the cost of your material inputs. And you hear about this stuff in the newspaper, people hedging their commodity risk. Well, in SMB world, that doesn't happen. So you have to bear that risk.
So is this I guess the practical takeaway here is when you're thinking about modeling the business moving forward, how this is going to affect cash flow and how this is going to affect your overall like EBITDA growth. Like that's I guess I assume the big takeaway. But is there anything that you can be doing, you think, to like if you knew, for example, that the commodity costs for this particular business were increasing and almost certainly going to be increasing moving forward in the future, would you use that as leverage to go back to the seller to get a lower price?
Yeah, I would. I think I'd study like where the costs are for those commodities relative to the cycle. And so you can kind of get a sense for, if they're up high, generally speaking, you should expect them hopefully over time to, go back to a more normalized number. Then you have to ask yourself, how are your prices, your revenues swinging up and down accordingly? Because usually, you can't raise your prices as fast to your customers as your vendors will raise on you, and there's a lag. So just getting a sense as to where those numbers are in the cycle is really helpful. And then just put it into the model and try and run a sensitivity analysis to say, hey, if cost go up 10% and I can't match on the revenue side, what's that going to do for my cash flow?
Do you think often the bigger players, like, do they have any real advantage to mitigate the increase in commodity costs that you're not going to be able to do as a small player?
Yeah. I mean, one great way to do it is just buy a lot of inventory
No, sit on
things
it.
are inexpensive, but that takes cash and working capital. So it's tough.
Yeah, where I was going with that line of thought is the advantage, it sounds like, of your business is that you had you guys were like the low cost player, and you were a high volume low cost player, and I would assume then your clients are attracted to the fact that your prices are rock bottom. And if you end up in a world in which this business, the commodity costs are growing, and the bigger players in the space have an ability to maybe tamp that down because they bought a ton of inventory, but you don't, you could end up in a world where you've got to increase prices to the point that you start to lose your customer base. Is that, I'm like playing out like multiple scenarios in the future here, but do you think that's like, how real is that concern, or how much did you guys deal with that in your business?
It's a very real concern. The good news is it's hard in a product business like this where we self-delivered. So customers in this world expect you to deliver to them, those distribution folks who are our customers. There is sort of a regional moat that you have because you still have to get the product there. So being close to your customers did give you some cost advantage there, but this is real. And the good news is, even though this was a small business, $6 million or so of top line, it's still a relatively big player in the patio screen door business generally. So we were not like a small fish in a massive pond.
Mm-hmm.
So that helped. Meaning we had the ability to buy a lot of product relatively.
So you could sort of ride some of this out, which maybe your smaller competitors trying to compete on cost couldn't do it.
Right. Exactly.
Relatedly, this question came in, which I think is a great one. What do you think how much did you guys raise prices every year? Let's assuming commodity costs just stayed the same. What do you think is the max what did you do? And what do you think is the max a customer base that's more like yours and high volume could do in terms of raising prices per year?
In patio products, we did not aggressively raise prices. This was a few years ago. So early on, we were not in an environment where inflation felt like it was bubbling. We felt like there were other ways, other much lower hanging fruit, like selling related products, because we were already making trips to those customers. So why not sell them more stuff? So we did not take that approach here. In a business that we just partnered with a self-funded searcher in February to close on, and also a light manufacturer, very different story. We got in there and realized that our prices had not been increased in a long, long time, that to some of our customer base, we were actually losing money net, and we went in there and aggressively changed our pricing strategy. Today, I think that's working well. There's a lot of cash out there. So a lot of customers have made money and are willing to absorb those price increases. So I think that has to be a strategy today.
Sure.
A few years ago, it didn't feel like the same environment.
What's aggressive? When you say aggressive, how much did you guys increase prices?
10 to 20%.
I
In
love
some
that.
cases more. And
That's great.
you hear this, but I think it's real.
Well,
Anyway,
I think for what it's worth, like the narrative around rising inflation rate moving forward, with the amount of money that's been printed in this country, I think you can leverage that narrative to basically say, oh, well, it's not me. Like all my inputs have gone up. Now 20%, that's hard to say, but I think you can rate. I think you could follow in that narrative. And to your point, with customers sitting on cash, that may be really really palatable depending on the industry.
yeah, in the trailer business, we sell to distribution again to dealerships. And so it's really easy to go to a dealer and see what they are selling to their retail customer and
Mhm.
know they put no value add on that product between when we make it and the retail customer buys it. So you can tell pretty clearly what their spread is. And you can then sort of infer how much price increase they can handle.
I love that. That makes a ton of sense. Last question for on this diligence part, but the natural question this begs is, there's this, like, how much can you push the seller and when can you push the seller to dig into these lines of inquiry? Like, when can you talk to the actual customers in the business? When can you go in to do this inventory check? Do you have a sense, like, once you're under LOI, when would you be doing these things?
Yeah. So now through having done a handful of deals, it's totally transaction dependent. Some sellers are just so nervous about anybody finding out that they will walk away from a deal if you require it. So you have to, God, I wish I could say there's like a silver bullet there. So other owners are just super transparent with all their team. Everybody
Mhm.
knows that they're going to sell the business. And we've been brought into companies before as the new owners before we even had a deal done. So it is totally deal specific there. I think you just have to identify what the key risks are and try and be maybe more nuanced in your diligence.
Mm.
If if there's big customer concentration, you clearly want to spend time diligencing that and maybe spend more of your negotiating chips on that piece of it instead of something else that maybe has less risk involved in it. And I know that's a generality, but that's
No,
what
I
I
think
got.
I think that makes a ton of sense, right? If there wasn't high customer concentration, right, that's not really a huge risk there. If there's a significant amount of inventory, there's obviously potentially a huge amount of risk there. So it sounds like where there is potentially big destructive forces to cash in the future, that's where you should be leaning in to ensure that you are getting to be able to do the diligence that you need to do. And it becomes a judgment call, I suppose, at some point, if the seller won't allow you to do that diligence.
Right.
And
And
I,
generally speaking, it's
okay.
a seller's market right now. So they kind of drive processes.
Mhm.
And if you just push too hard on too many diligence points, you're going to start getting some pushback. So just be thoughtful about where you're cashing in your chips.
Yeah, just briefly, when do you walk on that type of, like, I've been talking to a lot of searchers who are under IOI, or I shouldn't say under, like they submitted an IOI or got accepted, or their other LOI, and the seller is already sort of bristling at random questions. It feels like a red flag that just, rather than wasting their dollars on diligence, maybe they should just walk. But I feel like that just becomes so hard. You feel in the deal heat. Like, do you have a good rule of thumb on that, when to walk?
Um, God, that's a great question. Here we are, done this for a little while now, and I'm not sure it's a feel thing at this point. It's one of those questions like, what was the straw that broke the camel's back? You never really
Right.
know. You just got to a point where you felt like, you know what, this is just too much risk. Um, and sometimes maybe it's, a constant customer concentration issue where you are just getting pushback on the ability to learn more and dig in. And so then you have to go back to the seller and say, hey, look, dear seller, I need a price or a structure adjustment to be able to still close on this deal and absorb that risk. So you pick, dear seller, price and structure adjustment, or let me go diligence it, but I have to have one of those things. You pick which one.
Sure. And if they say sorry, you'd pull the trigger, walk away.
That's right.
Yeah, I think to your point, it's like all these things become emotional, and it all becomes deal specific. I do think, and I don't want, we can move on in a sec here, but I think it's important for for any searcher, just sort of have those clear guardrails of like, what do they expect? What do they need given the risks in the business? And when do you pull out or not? I just feel like it's this natural, like, sunk loss fallacy you end up in, where it's like you dedicated time, you've dedicated diligence dollars, and it's like, if the issues keep cropping up, I don't know. I think it's important to sort of establish that early on mentally, so you can pull out earlier if things aren't going to go forward.
Right.
In interest of time, Sam, do you have a super hard stop at 1, or if we go a few minutes over, are you okay?
Nope. Good to go for a little bit over.
All right. So we are going over. I do think that we can probably not spend a ton of time on some of these, but yeah, why don't you sort of talk through pitfalls, and then, maybe what's hard about the industry. I really want to spend some time there too.
Great. Yeah, I mean, this again goes back to personal bias, but overpaying is a recipe for disaster, just for a lot of reasons. You'll end up having more leverage than you necessarily want. And so, your margin for safety there in your cash flow is thinner. Most self-funded searchers, just because they're trying to own as much of a business as they can, are tightly financing their businesses. And so I think overpaying is just a humongous risk that people should avoid. Tough to do though right now, right? Market is a seller's market. There's inflation. I mean, it is a challenge. But let's be clear. Just to add a few like specific points, we have never bought a business yet north of 4.5 times EBITDA, and we have regularly bought in the 3s. Now,
is that 4.5 including working capital and including like transaction costs, or you're saying just on the price?
Nope, totally inclusive.
Cool. Do you think that's not to dwell too much, but like how closely would you adhere to that, depending on sort of the good versus great stuff we talked about earlier? Like, would you pay a little more for a great business, or you're never going to go beyond 4.5?
Well, I hope he's not listening, but we just submitted an IOI today that would most certainly be above the highest price we've paid to date, because it's a business we really like. So
what was that multiple?
What's a range? 4.5 to 5.5 on a business that's a bit bigger than this, but not too dissimilar of an industry. So we shall see.
Cool. Yeah, I think to your point, it's just it's competitive. Would you, in the good category of businesses that we talked about, would you avoid those, or would you just be willing? Would you do them if the deal was cheaper? I'm specifically talking about that earlier slide we did back here.
Yeah, I think I would do that, because again, this is not bad business versus great business. This is good business versus great business.
So you would still buy these. You would just price it accordingly.
Price and structure accordingly. And then, at the end of the day, a self-funded searcher with a bunch of skin in the game and, 24/7, 365 attention to a small business, I'm just fundamentally a believer that that's a great dynamic. So I think even, an inexperienced self-funded searcher can move the needle on a small business. But I'm talking my book there a little bit.
And what do you think is the minimum realistic multiple of EBITDA that you could acquire on a good business?
Minimum realistic?
Yeah, what would actually get a deal done in this market right now?
Yeah, I mean, I'm to the point where I think, EBITDA 4 times.
So you don't think you could do the 3.5 again, or the 3.3, whatever it was?
No, I kind of say that the old, and then this is EBITDA, the old 3 to 4 feeling nice is now 4 to 5, 3.5 to 4.5. I feel like everything's notched up a turn in these blue collar old school businesses.
Sure. Okay. Helpful. This working capital piece, I think we kind of touched on this. Anything more to elaborate there? We talked about it a lot, but anything to elaborate?
Yeah. No, this is one of those things I would say to all the self-funded searchers out there: go and get some education on working capital and how it works, because this is a way for brokers and sellers to really move purchase price up and down without the true purchase price changing. And there are just a lot of complexities here. Most people don't necessarily understand it, but how you deal with working capital, either within the purchase price or separate from a purchase price, is really important. So
Can you
especially
give
in
like the 1 or 2 minutes on that point? Because candidly, I'm less familiar with working capital as well. Elaborate, please.
yeah, I mean, just it's very simply, like some brokers will say, hey, look, we're going to sell you the business for 4 times, but that is just the core business. You're going to pay for inventory and AR separately. And it's like, well, what are you buying? But that's really obvious. A less obvious way to talk about it is, they've agreed that you're going to get $500,000 of working capital with the business, but you as a buyer might not realize that 20% of that AR balance is stale and maybe not collectible. Maybe 20% of that inventory balance is stuff up on the high shelves that would definitely never sell. So if you in your purchase price think you're getting 500 grand of net working capital, but really you're getting 200, I mean, that is a true purchase price adjustment to you
Yeah,
in a bad way. So I think you really have to dig in there.
that makes sense.
And then,
We talked about the seller note concept already, but anything more to elaborate there?
no, I mean, I'm a sucker for structure. I love it. I love aligning interests with the counterparty. So this is definitely a mechanism to dig in on, especially if you feel like price has already, you've fully negotiated price and you can't push that down anymore. There are other items here, forgivable seller notes, earnouts if you're not using SBA, et cetera, et cetera.
Cool. Just more of a specific technical question here, but on working capital, what's the average period working capital that you're typically looking? 60 days, 90-day average? Like what's the average you're looking at?
No, so we'll go back 2 years usually. And we kind of buy based on, relative size of the business. The business has grown recently. You need to buy working capital, and elevated working capital business with that business. We'll look at seasonality. So we've seen a lot of businesses where working capital will go like this based on season.
Yeah.
So go back, study it, model it. It takes time, but it's good learning.
Yeah. So at least a year, to your point about the seasonality, and then
Totally.
looking back further to even see, is there changes from year to year? Does it change quite a bit?
Yep.
And I think this is one of our, I guess, biggest lessons learned, but hard about the industry. Yeah, I would love your voiceover here.
Well, you told me to come on here and say that light manufacturing was easy, right?
Well, I think, I mean, to your earliest point, when I hear manufacturing, that I in my bones feel like, oh, that's like super complex and super capital intensive. And I think it turns off people like me, which I think is the real opportunity. But to your point, we've touched on a lot of the material cost, inventory management issues already. But I'd love to hear about maybe some other nuances that we haven't touched on that would be in particular about this category.
So one in particular is labor. And in the businesses, in the light manufacturing businesses that we've bought and been involved with, it is primarily minimum wage workers in the warehouse. And right now, politics aside, right now it's really hard to find and retain people that work in warehouses because, again, politics aside, there's opportunity cost there. And so that's been a huge challenge. And I think everybody is feeling that who employs less skilled, less costly labor.
Yep.
So that's one. I don't think there's a great answer there. There are tactics, but we can save that for later. I think another one is making sure that depending on the capital intensivity of the business, that you're either talking about EBITDA or free cash flow, but make sure you know the distinction there. Is there a necessary reinvestment in capital equipment that you're going to need to survive? Because if you're going to need it to survive or grow, you better factor it into your model and into your cash flow projections.
And would you go so far as to say like you're turned off by those businesses that require significant reinvestment in whatever machines, technology, or is it just a thing you need to be aware of and structure the deal accordingly?
Here's why it's hard. The deal might be selling for 5 times EBITDA. Let's keep the number simple. But if you have to invest every year 1 turn of EBITDA in capital expenditure, it's the purchase price has just gone up, unless the broker or the seller is willing to consider your argument, which is, I can't buy this on an EBITDA multiple. I'm buying this on a free cash flow multiple. And that's a big delta. And that's really like, that creates a lot of valuation deltas between buyer and seller bids. So I think that's what makes it tough.
That makes sense.
Technical complexity. Yeah, I mean, there's a flip side to this. Sometimes super complex manufacturers have a big moat. So, you look at like aerospace manufacturing, I think that's a whole nother webinar that you could do. But that's probably not this. This is light complexity, and we like that. Yep. Look, if you're used, second to last bullet point, if you're used to working in a office building, you've had white collar professional jobs, and you walk into a warehouse making patio screen doors or cargo trailers, you might walk in there and be like, what the heck is this? And what am I getting myself involved with? So the warehouses are just dirty. They are overwhelming. And, that's just part of the game.
Yeah, we're going obviously over, but I think to that point, I always struggle when I'm, as putting my investor hat on, when I'm talking to searchers who have no experience in any type of manufacturing industrial setting, looking to buy this type of business. Are you going to have a wake up call when you show up to this business, and are you going to just hate it? And so I guess how do you think about assessing folks when you're investing who are looking to buy this type of business, and whether they're a fit for this type of environment? And how should a searcher maybe be self-assessing? Like, how did you self-assess to say, like, this is the kind of business I want to buy?
Long but fun backstory for another day. Ask a searcher, or as a searcher, you should be willing to go in there and count the inventory yourself, because that's going to be your life. And if you would rather defer on some of that dirtier, sweatier work, a dirty warehouse business, probably not the right fit.
So being honest with someone, with yourself, with oneself, about, are you willing to get in the weeds? That's probably true of search in general, but in this one, it's like showing up to the warehouse, looking through the boxes, like getting dirty, as you said.
Correct. I think that's a really good proxy for it.
And how do you assess, like, who wouldn't say yes in a conversation? What do you think is a way to assess that beyond sort of someone's answer?
So as an investor, it's maybe hard to tag along, but go with the searcher to go do the inventory count and see is if you're going to get into a business like this, you have to be willing to spend 3 hours side by side, the owner or the GM or the staff, counting this stuff when it's hot and messy. And if 30 minutes in, you're ready to go back to your spreadsheet and model, it's not like the indicator that this is the wrong business. It's just part of the full story, that maybe that doesn't, that part of the gig is going to be a challenge to you. And it doesn't mean that, on the flip side, doesn't mean it's not the right business for you, because you probably, as a searcher, shouldn't be in the warehouse counting product every day once you are the owner. But it's sort of part of the full picture that this product in this warehouse is going to be a part of your life for the next 5 or 10 years.
Totally. And this last point about cyclicality, this is true of lots of different industries, but anything in particular about, you think, light manufacturing?
Yeah, no, probably not. This is just generally speaking. I always, for some reason, cyclicality in the service business seems, just because we look at a lot of testing and maintenance businesses, which tend to be super steady, product, especially in building products, can swing. So I would imagine that's the case for, a fair bit of manufacturers.
Yeah, that makes sense. So thinking about lessons learned, I think we touched on some of these, but why don't we maybe wrap here around what you feel like you've learned, apply moving forward?
Yeah, so saying to be patient is great, but it's hard. But it did pay off here, and it's paid off in other deals now for us. The boomerang deal does happen. So don't be afraid as a searcher and a buyer. Put a fair bid in. If the broker says not going to work, you never know. The other buyer who gets it signed up under LOI might not close, and it might boomerang back, and that's a great dynamic for buyers.
What's the best way, you think, to, if you're doing a proprietary search or this is probably less true proprietary, right? Because this is when really in a broker situation. But is it just like following up with the broker, or is there something more that would help
Yeah.
maximize that odds?
No, I think it's just effort. So if you are interested in the deal and you've done your work, don't be afraid. Put the offer out there. Look credible, be real, and then stay in touch. Stay around the hoop. That phrase is so true. Just stick around the hoop. You're supposed to be doing that anyway as a searcher with brokers. And I think patience can pay off in those boomerang deals. We mentioned before sort of the incumbent GM who's going to stay on, plus a very passive seller who's not going to stay on. That is a really good opportunity for a searcher to operate on a business and not in a business. And that distinction is real. So we just partnered with a self-funded searcher here on a business called Express Trailers, and it's the perfect dynamic. There is a sort of a business GM and a production manager who together run the business independently. And so John, our searcher partner, is able to run that business, be the business president, and think strategically, and doesn't have to worry about production issues every single day or business issues every single day. He's working on the business. Yeah, look, number 3, managing people is hard. Managing people is hard. And I was probably not a great operator for this very reason. I think, big staffs, that managing staffs of people is just hard. And you have to maybe identify, this is the job you're signing up for as a CEO, is to manage people, and just be conscious of that fact. Number 4, again, like, this is a product business, so be careful of inventory and material costs. This is not just labor like services. And then, when you make a product and you see it ship, there's just something satisfying about that you don't get when techs go out and repair something. You never really see that. So, the product business is cool. It's fun to see it around town. Especially in the trailer business, we drive around all the time now, and we'll see our trailers on the road, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean, to that last point, or not even the last point, but just sort of reflecting in general on this category, now that you've you've acquired one company and now sort of co-acquired with this other searcher, another company. Is this a space you're going to continue to double down on? Like, you sort of love what you've learned and what you're seeing, or is this sort of, great, you love the space, but you're looking at acquiring in others as well?
Well, we're just trying to do what everybody else is doing, aren't we? All trying to buy HVAC businesses.
It's in 2 weeks, man. We're talking HVAC in 2 weeks. No, and I see it seriously. Like, feels like a lot of what you're saying, it's like you've just gained such a depth of understanding here, but at the same time, I know you're investing in other categories, and it feels like you could apply a lot of this to other industries too. So how do you think about that?
So both. We are, like I said, just submitted an IOI and another light manufacturer that's more like a fab shop. A fair bit bigger than this one, but still right down the middle of the fairway in terms of like understanding and lessons that can be transferred. And yet at the same time, looking a bit at service businesses, just because I'm a sucker for repair and maintenance, and I love the recur on that. Comparing what we buy versus what your background is in software, I would love to get to a more sort of recurring revenue model, and light manufacturing is not. It's at best repeating. So working on that.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, I do want to take a few open questions that maybe people want to send in, but just major thing that you'd want the listeners here to take away from this conversation, if there was one thing.
Yeah, and that one thing is, there is just sort of this black cloud over manufacturing generally in the search world. At least my perception is that that's the case. And I think for the right light manufacturer, it feels almost as much like a service business as it does a manufacturer. And so I think also, because purchase prices tend to be depressed here, it can be a really great opportunity and a place where people shouldn't just click delete when the teaser comes in. They might want to take a closer look.
Sure. I mean, to your point about it being service-like, are you referring to your own experience where the screen doors wear out, and so you have this like repeat purchase history, or is there something more nuanced to that point?
Yeah, it's that there's a repeating nature to the revenue because the product is not sticking around for 40 years.
Yeah,
And then
exactly.
there's also sort of the labor component. It's not heavy capital equipment manufacturing product. It's people make it, essentially creating a service, which is they're creating they're servicing the materials in the warehouse, and just so happen to be making a door that we ship. But it's mostly a people business, just like the service businesses are.
I hear you. That makes sense. Well, Sam, I appreciate you hopping on today, because I do want to, because a few questions that have come in that we didn't touch on, so we'll take a couple minutes to do that. But just
Yeah,
before
shoot.
we do that, where could people, how can they reach out? How would you prefer they reach out? Where can they follow you? How can they learn more?
Yeah, so I had to grow up and join Twitter, so you can catch me on Twitter. I'm pretty active there. It's become a great community. I've learned so much on Twitter, so I'm a big fan. See me there. Send me an email. I talk to a lot of searchers, try and partner with as many of them as we can. And hopefully here soon we'll be announcing a bit of an incubator program. So it'll be fun.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm excited for that.
Cool.
Yeah, look, appreciate everyone listening in on the call, and please, Sam has been again a great resource for me and a great partner with stuff we're doing together. So I found him to be really open and transparent, obviously in this conversation and in others. So yeah, I would definitely recommend you all reach out. If you liked this webinar and have time, right? Admittedly, we went long on this one. Hopefully, I'll be less long-winded next time. Please shoot an email to webinars@bluemaple.co. You'll get invited to all the future ones. Next week, or sorry, in 2 weeks, hosting, it'll focus on HVAC. So I met a guy who has acquired HVAC service business and knows that business inside and out, and is going to be, again, transparently talking about his success and challenges there. If you have questions, toss them in, because I'm just going to pop around a few things here. I was doing a pretty good job of asking a lot of them as they came in. We touched on multiples, touched on diligence. Let me just scroll through here. We didn't talk much about the opportunities for growth with a business like this. So where do you see are the maybe 2 or 3 obvious growth avenues in a light manufacturing platform that you might acquire?
Right. So we took the approach, we talked about it, raise prices. So it's growth in a different dynamic. There's no extra pain there, just raise price. I think there's also, you can usually sell a customer ancillary related products. They're already buying it from somewhere. You're probably already delivering it. Why not just sell the same customers more stuff? So that's where we've started.
And do I've talked to a handful of searchers who are looking at deals where there's just a natural constraint on, and it's going to take 1.5 years to get the specialized equipment to be able to expand production. And so how do you think about those scenarios? Is that where you sort of pivot, as you said, to sort of sell an ancillary product that maybe does use a specialized equipment, or is there something else to help juice that growth when you have those constraints?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a great question. We haven't taken that approach. We haven't really been in like the inventing business, which I wish we were, create a product business. I think that takes a lot of market and technical knowledge to know, hey, you can tweak a product to do this, and that'll be a whole new growth avenue. We haven't gotten there yet. I don't think I'm not smart enough for that.
I don't know, but not smart enough, but you can clearly haven't needed to go down that route with the success you've had. The another interesting question that came in around, with inflation and rising input costs, are you seeing already consolidation within some of these small players? And if so, do you think that's a unique growth case opportunity where if you're able to pull off a transaction, the maybe future M&A opportunities may be greater or at greater multiples? You think that's the case here?
I do. Yeah, I've actually seen it happen. I do think that there is some value, some optionality in just getting in the game at a low cost basis, because it is just the case. Strategic buyers, financial buyers, everybody is going down market. And if you can just get in the game, you're kind of buying yourself an option on that upside. Sure. So I think that's
that's the proponent of like search in general, or like self-funded, where the deals are a lot smaller. But do you think this idea of inflation or rising costs that are going to be difficult will like drive the consolidation to accelerate that, or do you think that's not necessarily the case?
I do. Numbers work better at scale usually. So, I think that definitely is the case. And, if you're a consolidator and you become bigger, you have more negotiating leverage with your suppliers, which is where all of that inflation pressure is on your material inputs, right? So
Sure.
if you're bigger and more important to your vendor, because, flip the bill, you are customer concentration to your vendor, then you can negotiate better. I think that's real.
Cool. Question came in about sort of brokered search versus proprietary and how to stay in touch with brokers. And I think, I feel like my takeaway is often I see broker deals being very competitive, and so they get bid up. Whereas proprietary, you can get them at a better deal. But how do you think? Do you rely heavily on brokers versus try to do proprietary? And if you're going the broker route, you made the point of staying in touch, staying around the hoop. Like, how are you doing that tactically? How often? And calls versus emails?
Great question. I'm a big fan. Counterintuitively, start with brokers when you're searching. Get a bunch of reps. It will help you see deals and learn faster than if you do proprietary. I am actually not a huge fan of proprietary when you're searching because it might take years for a proprietary sourcing to turn into a transactable deal, and it takes a ton of time. So, and there are enough brokers running poor processes that you can find a needle in a haystack through the broker channel. And then what do you do to stay around the hoop? Yeah, you do all the above. You kind of automate your email blast to brokers. I'm a big fan of the pick up the phone, and I think that makes a difference.
How often are you doing that? How often would you call a broker that, let's say you submitted that LOI, was rejected? How often are you following up?
On a business I like a lot, every month.
And with like brokers in general, how often would you do it?
We break them down in tiers. So your tier one, high, and then sort of scale down your outreach from the top. Your sort of pyramid to the bottom.
How many would you say would, like, again, I'm like digging in deep here. How many would you say were your tier ones, and how often are you touching them versus maybe tier three? How often are you touching them, and how many are there?
I'd say 10%. Of probably of the 400 on our list, there's probably 40 that we want to touch a lot. There's probably 10 that we touch almost every week. But I will say, like, big caveat, we're a geographically focused, firm. We really stay within Florida, and we really like West Central Florida. And when you have a geographic focus, it can pay off to be hanging around the hoop if you're a repeat buyer. These are people that we're going to build a career with. So it's worth the investment in time to be dealing with brokers and bankers over and over and over again in our market.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's funny. I'm happy you sort of underscored the point about sort of the broker channel. Especially, I didn't expect you going that route, given your earlier point that you're sort of a deal hunter by nature, or like a value buyer. But I mean, certainly it's more efficient. And I guess if you're doing the outreach, what I love about proprietary search is it's like a machine that you're feeding, right? You just like churning through owners. And it sounds like you're kind of taking a similar approach to some degree with the broker channel, right? You've got hundreds of brokers, you're tiering them out, you're doing a mix of email and phone outreach. Like, feels like maybe they're not so dissimilar after all, the ways in which to stay in touch.
Yeah. A couple quick nuances. So of the 5 closings, we've had 4 be through brokers. 1 was proprietary. The proprietary ones take a long time to come back. So if you've got only a 18-month window to search, you got to ask yourself, are you going to be there when they're ready to sell?
Yeah, fair. Cool, man. There are a couple other more, I think, nuanced questions that I'm going to save. If you guys have those, kick them to Sam, and I'm sure he'd be willing to sort of riff with you over email or call. Otherwise, thanks again for those of you who stuck around for the extra 20 minutes. Thank you, Sam, for sticking around and being willing to do this. And yeah, if you have any feedback for me as well, this is the first one. So shoot either webinars or shoot me a note directly, just tony@bluemaple.co, and would love to hear it. So have a good rest of the day, guys.
It goes without saying, by the way, thanks for doing what you're doing for the self-funded world. There's a lot out there for the traditional folks, but not nearly as much for the self-funded folks. So we appreciate all the energy you're putting into it.
Yeah, thanks, man. I enjoy it, honestly. So yeah, happy to be a resource, and looking forward to seeing where this all goes. Thanks again, everybody.
Same.
Have
See
a
you
good
soon.
one. Take care.